Welcome, everyone, both in the room and online. My name is Sebastian Burka. I am the Executive Director of the Stigler Center. And today we're happy to host, in partnership with our colleagues at the Rustandy Center, a conversation with Professors Karthik Ramanna and John Paul Rollert on Professor Ramanna's new book, The Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World. And the book is available for sale and signature at the end of the room over there, and we'll have time after this for you to chat with Professor Ramanna and Professor Rollert as well. So thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules for this relevant and timely conversation. This event is part of the Stigler Center's speaker series, so please check our website for future programs as well as our publication promarket.org. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to our Capitalism podcast. The next episode will be on Visa and the middleman economy. I would also like to highlight an upcoming event that the Rustandy Center will host on January 23rd on Innovating for Social Equality, FinTech for Inclusion. You can find more details and sign up on the Rustandy Center website. But before we begin, please note we are on the record live streaming and we will post the event video on our YouTube channel later. If you have any questions for our speakers, we will have time at the end. Please wait for the microphone before speaking. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And now, please allow me to very briefly introduce our speakers. Karthik Ramanna is a professor of business and public policy at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government and a fellow at St. John's College. He has won numerous awards, including the Journal of Accounting and Economics Best Paper Prize, the Harvard Business Review McKinsey Award for groundbreaking management thinking, and 3 times the International Case Center Prize for outstanding case writing, dubbed by the Financial Times as the Business School Oscars. And our moderator today is John Paul Rollert. He is adjunct associate professor of behavioral science here at Booth and also teaches at Harvard. His research focuses on the intellectual history of capitalism, the ethics of leadership, and the application of empathy to law, business, and politics, among others. He has published in numerous academic journals and popular publications and was recognized by the Society of American Business Editors and Writers in 2017 Best in Business Competition. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Rollert. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you all for joining us here today. Karthik, thank you for being here. I want to start by going to the origins of The Age of Outrage, your book. You start by telling this story about your journey from teaching at HBS and going over to Oxford to teach at the Blavatnik School of Government. And you thought, in light of your experience at HBS, you were prepared for the students you would encounter. The students seemed to challenge and surprise you in certain ways that ended up inspiring this book. I was hoping to start by you sharing that story.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you first for having me here. And I remember being in this very room a few years ago when I was talking about my previous book, which is a very different book. It's a very technical book with, and it's a University of Chicago Press book. So it has more pages of endnotes than it does of text.
As any good University of Chicago.
There we go. Yes. You know, when I moved from HBS to the University of Oxford, I moved to become the first director of the Master of Public Policy program at Oxford at the newly created Blavatnik School of Government. And I had been teaching at that point for several years the required leadership course at HBS in the MBA program. And, you know, we, of course, had a very diverse classroom, and I had a fabulous time teaching it. And I thought, okay, that skill will port into this context. But what very quickly struck me, we had about 120 students. There were, I think, about 30 or 40 of them were Rhodes Scholars, so very bright. We also had some Commonwealth Scholars, Chevening Scholars. They ranged in age from 21 to 51. So it was, we'd created an intergenerational program rather than a program that sort of catered to one particular age group. And perhaps most saliently, they came from, in that first year, I think, over 70 different countries. And one of the things that immediately became evident is that, for instance, there were more students from China than there were from the UK. There were as many students from China as there were from the US. There were as many students from Russia as there were from the UK. So there was this sort of tremendous diversity across and everyone in some sense was an international student. And you know, in the HBS classroom, as I'm sure in the classroom here, you can hold certain truths to be self-evident, right? You can say, well, you know, particularly in a school of business, we think that business is a force for good, and it will, you know, enable you to create prosperity and enable human flourishing and things like that. And of course, you know, every objective or every premise that you might hold could be legitimately challenged by someone in that room who's very bright, very passionately committed to advancing their conception of a good society, but had completely different perspectives from yourself. And as the director of this program, as the person who is responsible for convening them and then sending them off into careers in high public office, many of them are now cabinet ministers or heads of government agencies, governors, mayors. We don't yet have a president or prime minister, but I think the program's only 10 years old, so we're watching. But I said, at the very least, I should do no harm in this situation by convening all of these people together and having them, you know, spend the year together. But hopefully we do some good about it. And so I did what any academic does when they don't know how to do something, which is you go teach a course on it. So I basically titled the course "How to Lead in a Polarized World." I had no clue. And but what I did was I invited, so Oxford terms are very short. They're 8 weeks. So I invited 8 friends who happen to be, you know, CEOs or COOs of large organizations, some from business, some from government, some from the not-for-profit sector. So there was one person who ran one of the largest alcohol companies in the UK. There was, on a very different scale, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London, the head of one of the largest hospital systems in Europe. So that sort of gave you a sense of the kind. So my rule was no consultants, no bankers. It needed to be someone who was actually in sort of an operational role, right? Actually ran something. And I said, bring us your hardest challenge in the context of managing in this environment. Don't tell us what you did. We'll have a, you know, sort of a Socratic method conversation about that. But also bring us your favorite piece of reading. So it could be a journal article from an academic journal. It could be an article in something like Harvard Business Review, which is more practitioner focused, or it could even be a poem from Shakespeare. You know, anything that you think really sort of helps you intellectually in this moment. And that was the first basis for this course, and it then went on, you know, became a required course in the curriculum and so forth. And so when I was done being director of the program, and at some point we'll say why, but quite frankly, because I was just exhausted, I stepped down after 8 years, and I said, well, it'd be a shame to lose all of that sort of capital that we had, intellectual capital we built up in the course, which is sort of the genesis of this book. We started putting those ideas down and saying, how might we make sure that we sort of recorded it?
Well, and what's interesting is that the subtitle is How to Lead in a Polarized World. But the main title is The Age of Outrage, right? So there's a sense in which part of this experience helped to qualify for you this particular moment we're in. And specifically, you describe it as an era of institutional distrust that we're living through. What do you mean by that? Say a little bit more about that.
So one of the themes, the premises of the book is that managing in the age of outrage is not managing outrage. So managing outrage is sort of like crisis management, and you know we're actually quite good at it. We've got sort of, you'll have a good PR group that will sort of figure out, you know, who the people to call and how do you do that and so forth. But there's an element of firefighting to that. Managing in the age of outrage raises 2 important issues. One, there are some structural causes for that outrage, as you've suggested, that might be quite legitimate. And you might necessarily not want to simply manage them away through PR. You might want to sort of say, okay, well, what can I genuinely do about this, given constraints of the organization I run? But it's also the fact that if you try to run, or you try to manage in the age of outrage using sort of standard PR techniques, you very quickly exhaust yourself. You very quickly get to a place where, imagine if you're constantly in firefighting mode, right? You very quickly get to a point where you won't be able to do anything else. You can't do any fire prevention, let alone, you know, thinking about growth and thinking about human flourishing and all of the things that really are the reason why you're there in that organization. So that's a key premise of what it is we're trying. What do we mean by the age of outrage? So in my estimation, there are three factors that really matter here. The first is what we call a fear of the future. You've got factors like AI that promise to be potentially as disruptive as the Industrial Revolution was to life as we knew it before the IR. We've had, obviously we have a lot of concerns about climate change and how that will change the societies and the communities in which we live with rising sea level, changing monsoon winds and things like that. And then, of course, you have concerns associated with the shifting demographics. Most Western countries are rapidly aging, and by the year 2050, half of all the human capital in the world, half of all the people under the age of 18 in the world will be in sub-Saharan Africa. So the world will look very, very different as soon as 2050. So all this sort of precipitates what we call a fear of the future, a sense that the future will look very different from the one that we're used to or we've grown used to. The second factor that you layer onto this is this sense, as you indicated, that we can't really trust our institutions, because if we lived in an era where we've got a fear of the future, but we thought our institutions are really robust and doing a good job for the people they serve, maybe we'd be okay. But we are, by some measures, trust in government institutions, particularly in the Western world, is the lowest it's been since the 1930s. And so we're living basically in a time where we don't trust our institutions. There's evidence to suggest that the very wealthy, so the 0.01%, pay lower marginal tax rates and lower effective tax rates than people who are middle income or lower income. So people feel like they've been sort of handed a raw deal on issues like globalization or low-skilled immigration. And so is that sort of, we're doing this in an era of distrust. And the third factor that probably contributes to this is what we call ideologies of othering. So this is an increasing sense in sort of our social context and our political context to view these as problems of us versus them, rather than as something that can be in an enlightenment spirit solved through, the pursuit of a global humanism. And so it's that ideologies of othering. There was in the early 1990s, Frank Fukuyama wrote this book about the end of history, where he said, well, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, liberal democracy and free markets have triumphed, and we'll soon very much progress to nothing interesting will happen. But at the same time, his former doctoral supervisor, Sam Huntington, wrote a sort of a counterpoint to that called The Clash of Civilizations, where he said, oh no, these civilizational conflicts, they're just part of who we are, and they will rear their ugly head. And in fact, the original Huntington article is remarkably prescient about a war in Ukraine. And he says, I think he even goes on to say that it would be silly for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons, which seems in hindsight something very prescient. But in any event, I mean, it seems like we're calling back to this basic or base human tendency toward tribalism. And that sort of, so all three of these factors, a fear of the future, a raw deal, and this ideologies of othering, they've quite frankly always been present in society. But part of what we're dealing with today is the degree to which they manifest themselves, and also, the fact that they're all there at once, right, and they're manifesting in this sort of to this degree. And you put these things together, and this is sort of what we call the age of outrage. And now the question is how we manage.
Right. I mean, so much of the book takes up the question of how you manage this kind of deep sense of distrust. And you introduce a 4-part framework to do so. I want to talk a little bit about the framework in a second. But first, to give people a sense of kind of the kind of ambition of the framework and the scope of the book, I want to cite one passage from you and ask you about it. You say here that the framework I have developed is not intended to be a replacement for essential conversations about organizational strategy or values. That is, questions of what to do over the long run. The framework's purpose, rather, is to create space for those conversations to emerge as part of its checklists. And its core focus is managerial. That is, it addresses issues of how to operate over the intermediate long run. So tell us a little bit about this difference between the how and what, and how it kind of shapes, again, the ambition and scope both this framework as well as the book you're trying to put forward.
That's right. So that's really important because, as I alluded to earlier, some of the forces that are provoking the outrage in society might be very legitimate, depending on your perspective. You might sort of be very sympathetic to that. And so in an organizational capacity, let's say you are the commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police, or you are the head of the largest hospital system in Europe, or you are the CEO of Nestle. These are various organizations profiled in the book. You have to deal with these questions. You have to deal with these substantive questions. And in fact, you can't say, one of the case studies in the book is Disney and how they tried to, in some sense, wash their hands off the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. It's very hard to, in that moment, after you made all of these implicit commitments to LGBT friendliness as a company, as Disney, to say, oh, well, now that there's an anti-gay bill going through the Florida legislature, we don't do politics, so we're not going to get, right? Because that hypocrisy actually puts you into even more trouble. So there is a very important set of conversations you need to have about strategy and values. But that obviously will be contextual. I mean, what's right for Disney is not what's right for Exxon, for instance, right? They have different strategies, they have different objectives in the world. And so that has to be a conversation that happens. The question is, how does that conversation happen, right? When you have, for instance, a workforce that might be deeply divided on these issues, when you have a customer base that is deeply divided on these issues, when you have investors deeply divided, and when you have sort of politicians. Part of the reason Disney was trying to sort of stay out of the political process in Florida was at the time Governor DeSantis was running for the Republican nomination for president. So he was trying to drive this agenda as part of his campaign. And so you have to manage across all those things. The question is how you do that. And that's what the framework focuses on.
And so you introduce this kind of four-part framework. And without giving away kind of the entire book, can you talk a little bit about that four-part framework? And maybe if it's helpful, you could use as an illustration this example from Disney and Bob Chapek's failures.
Yep.
To do a good job in managing the outrage that surrounded him in light of the Don't Say Gay bill.
Yeah. So the first and most important, I'd say, before we get to the four parts, sort of the basic element of this is turning down the temperature, right? Because if you're dealing with a situation where tempers are elevated, then you're not going to get anything done. And when I talk about turning down the temperature, I really talk about it from the manager's point of view, in the sense of, because there's this tendency of managers and leaders to think that they're somehow above it all and everybody else is animated and more prone to be sort of aggressive, and you have to work to turn down their temperature. But it's often you who might be the problem, right? And sort of the best example I've heard of this is you don't want to be a surgeon that goes from one operating theater to the next without washing your hands. And in the same way, you don't want to be a manager or a CEO going from one context to the next without washing their hands. And so in that sense, turning down the temperature is really important. And that particular part of the book focuses on, in some sense, the science of aggression. Where does aggression come from in the brain? And what are the implications of that for you as a manager? So something as simple as the ambient context plays a huge role in whether you're triggered to an aggressive state or not. So if you're in, fielding questions from your stakeholders, say at a podium like that, with the lights shining at you, and the temperature is in the room is quite warm, and everybody's sort of raising their hand trying to get in, you're far more likely to be prone to an outrage event yourself as a leader than if you were sitting in a quiet room with cool air conditioning and a circular table. So, there's some studies that suggest circular tables are better than rectangular tables, because rectangular tables just put you sort of in that adversarial position right off the bat. So simple things like that, really tactical things matter, because we'd like to think that we're somehow, uber rational and somehow we'll be able to see past all that. But these things come to play. But beyond that, of course, you want to be able to think about your cognitive response, or what you think of as your rational response in these situations as well. Because what the science of aggression says is that when we respond in a way that we think is rational or cognitive, it's really a product of what the literature calls knowledge structures. And you might sort of think of these as scripts or lived experiences. But the way the brain is reasoning, it is effectively starting from a set of axioms. And those axioms then serve as the basis for your logical reasoning. Those foundational axioms are a product of your past life and the experiences you've exposed yourself to. And so what you might think of as a cognitive response or a rational response in a particular situation might, somebody else with a different set of knowledge structures will come at that very, very differently. And so one managerial implication of that is to surround yourself with people who are trusted, but who also have very different knowledge structures from your own, right? And what really good managers do is build those communities of trust with very diverse sets of stakeholders well before they need it, right? And so that's, so starting just from the science of aggression, you can get some insights into what it is you want to be doing in these situations. There's a neuroscientist in the book that I quote, Anil Seth, who defines consciousness as controlled hallucination. And there's actually more nerves going from the brain to the eye than from the eye to the brain. And I mean, you say, wait, that doesn't make sense. The idea is the signals are going this way, but the brain isn't working that way. It's coming up with its own narratives of everything that it's almost sitting there hallucinating in Anil Seth's words. And then every so often, a few times a second, it gets an impulse from the or a signal from the outside world. Oh yes, this roughly corroborates with the story I'm telling myself in my head, and then you just keep telling yourself the story. So these things matter, and your awareness of these things matter as managers as you're going into the situation. So that's sort of where we would start with this.
Well, one of the things you talked a lot about some of the science that underpins this book, but as a lapsed humanist, one of the things that really strikes me is this emphasis on virtue, right? You talk a great deal about resilience, temperance, empathy. And I wonder if it kind of connects to this quote that you cite from another esteemed Oxford professor, Isaiah Berlin, in describing kind of managerial judgment. So he says, a highly developed discrimination of what matters from this rest is kind of the essence of managerial judgment, that you're able to discriminate what ultimately matters, especially given the fact that you're currently at a data-driven institution, right? I'm curious what this insight means to you, this question of discrimination, which seems maybe partly scientific, but also a part of a dispositional matter as well, too, and how it kind of connects to this larger discussion you engage, not just of science, but also virtue.
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely right. So Berlin has written this fabulous essay. He wrote it, I think, in the late 90s in the New York Review of Books, and it's called On Political Judgment. And he defines judgment as a well-developed discrimination of what matters from the rest. It's such a beautiful definition because in some sense, the moment you hear it, it's so self-evident, and say, why didn't I think of that? But that's sort of, he says, look, the hardest challenges in life will be the ones that can be informed by data and analysis and, logical reasoning and so forth. But they eventually involve you making a judgment call. And what is that judgment call, and how do you build a capacity for that judgment call? That's where, effectively the humanist tradition is very sort of relevant. And starting from sort of the Socratic method and the classical Greeks, we're talking about what are the virtues of good judgment, and they cite 4 in particular, right? Wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. And that goes into play into this. So it's in some sense not an either or, because a good data analysis will tell you what is probably infeasible. But eventually, when you're making the right call, that's going to be a matter of judgment. And there's another quote in the book from the advice Dwight Eisenhower gives the young John Kennedy when Kennedy is about to be sworn in as president. And of course, Kennedy was at the time youngest man elected president. And Eisenhower was this great, war hero, 5-star general and all that. So Kennedy asked him for advice. And Eisenhower says, no easy matter should ever come to you as president. If it is easy, it should be settled at a lower level, right? So he's saying 2 things there. He's saying, one, the nature of your job is such that it shouldn't be easy. But he's also saying something about how you construct an organization, not just the White House, but how you construct the US government so that, you know, decisions are made at the level where, you know, it's appropriate, where information is rests. And that's where the sort of the data part comes in. So.
Well, we're gonna turn to student questions or audience questions generally here in a moment. So I'm putting you all on notice for start thinking through your questions. But I want to follow up with one thing you kind of noted about decision making and judgment generally. A lot of the examples that you draw from come from government and NGOs.
Yes.
Not all, but a lot of them do. How does judgment and decision making and some of these matters differ when we get to those distinctly non-democratic institutions that are private companies?
Yeah.
Right. Or even publicly traded companies for that matter.
Yeah.
Are there a different series of kind of pressures that those leaders are dealing with, and how well does kind of that framework apply to a setting where you feel as though you have to constantly make decisions and be decisive?
Yeah. So I just came back from Google, where I was giving a talk on this book, amongst other things. And Google CEO famously, you know, when the war in the Middle East sort of really escalated, and his employees were sort of protesting that Google was sort of perhaps enabling one side or the other, his employees were protesting that Google was not taking a strong enough voice on this issue. He said, look, we are a business. We can't talk about these things at work. Is that the right decision? Right? I mean, because you said it's like, in some sense, he's the CEO. This is a private for-profit company accountable to shareholders. It has to make money. And that's what we're here to do. This is what the CEO says. Now, part of the reason that particular directive or diktat does not land well is that Google is its key asset, but one would argue its only asset is its employees. It's not an Exxon or a Chevron where they've got, you know, oil under the ground and things like that. This is their asset. And one of the things that struck me about my visit to Mountain View yesterday was how committed the organization is in building the tribe of what are called Googlers, right? And then the dogs of Googlers are called Douglers, and you know, so you see this everywhere. I mean, that is the identity, that is the culture of this organization, and they're doing a fabulous job at that. And because they say these are our key assets, we want these people to feel invested in this community. We want them to feel like this is home, right? You can, I mean, you don't even have to leave the campus. Everything is there, right? It's just so magnificently comfortable. And then when something so personal happens, to say, oh no, we're a business. We can't be talking about that. That jars, right? So even if it is the right answer, and you know, maybe you think it is the right answer, part of it is, now that you are managing in this age of outrage, how do you create the conditions where it is the employees who discover or uncover that that is the right answer, rather than you sort of drive that down from the top? Because that's what makes it difficult, right? What really successful managers have done, as we profile in the book, is they say, okay, well, we would really like the organization to land in place X, but maybe it will land in place X, maybe it'll land in place X -2 or X +2, we don't know. But if I try to force this on my culture, if I try to force this on my team, I will exhaust my goodwill very, very quickly. And then when the next crisis comes, I won't have that goodwill. So how do I create an environment where people have the conversation and come to recognize this is the right thing to do? And if they come to a completely different decision from what you think is the right thing, then maybe you've created the wrong culture, or you have the wrong employees, or you're the wrong CEO, right? So that's part of what this kind of conversation will entail. And so he might be right about where he's trying to go, but the question is how to do it. This is why I say in the preface of the book, this is a book of the how rather than the what, because the what is something you figure out, but then you need people to own this, because you're saying Googlers everywhere, right? So it's how do you get there? That's, yeah.
Well, one follow-up, and then we'll turn to the audience. So let's go down the street from Google to Facebook. The slogan, move fast and break things.
Yes.
Which I often tell my students, I think is kind of the quintessence of the idea of creative destruction.
Yes.
That the essence of capitalism is to move fast and break things.
Yeah.
Let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah.
In many respects, the vision that you're giving, one, not necessarily of consensus, but creating a space where there can be an acceptance of how decisions ultimately need to be made.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to sit very neatly with that vision of creative destruction. So I'm curious, how do we square that? I mean,
Yeah.
it might be that actually creative destruction doesn't capture the essence of capitalism.
Yeah.
But to a degree, the idea that we need to slow down, we need to make time for consensus and deliberation seems very much at odds with this idea that we need to move at top speed, we need to make
Yeah.
decisions, we need to make mistakes, and we need to keep on going.
Yeah.
And people simply can't be too precious. And actually, that's fundamentally the lesson they need to learn. Stop being so precious.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise we can't get things done. Now, that's, I would say, much more probably a point of view that you get at a place like this versus across the way at the Harris School, right?
Yeah.
But how do you think about that?
I think it's not an either or, right? So Toyota is a great example of a company that squares this circle. So one of the things that my colleagues Rebecca Henderson and Bob Gibbons have spent a fair bit of time describing is the culture of what they call a relational contract at Toyota. And we talk about this in the book. And what does that entail? That entails, so there's a great example of a seasoned manager from another car company who is hired into Toyota to run an assembly line. And Toyota is, known for its efficiency. Its inventories are held usually on the basis of hours rather than days or weeks, et cetera. So it's a company that moves very, very fast. It's innovating. It's made bold bets, and it seems to have made a really bold and somewhat so it seems like a very reasonable bet by betting on hybrid vehicles rather than electric vehicles. So this is a company that does innovation quite well, at least so far. And this manager is brought in from this other context, and he says, well, if you move this parts rack a little closer to this assembly line, you'll save some time. And that's what we're about. Move fast, right? And his supervisor says, whoa, whoa, whoa. What do you mean move it closer? How much closer? 6 inches? 3 inches? And how much time are we going to save per car? 4 seconds? 7 seconds? If you can't specify that, you haven't thought through what it is you're suggesting. So I need to know what those specifics are. And if, in fact, we save more time or less time, I need to know why. If we moved it 3 centimeters and you said it was 4 seconds, but we ended up saving 7 seconds, we need to understand that too, right? So what is that saying? That is saying that Toyota is a company that has figured out how to delegate information, but also to train people to make intelligent decisions, right? You can't delegate without training people to have the judgment, to go back to Berlin, to make the calls that they need to. And oftentimes the mistake that companies make is to delegate and expect that somehow magically now obviously the nature of judgment is such that you don't know what is right until well after the fact. But that's why investing in training people to have good judgment, and that's quite frankly what business schools and schools of government do, education for judgment. That's a really essential part of delegation. So there's actually sort of 3 steps to this, and often companies don't get, or organizations for that matter, don't get all 3 steps right, because first you want to delegate and resist the urge as a manager to sort of hold everything in your camp. Then you need to train people to actually make the good decisions, have the good judgment that they should, and then you of course have to resist the urge to punish them should they fail. Because that's the other big mistake that people make, right? That when you delegate and people fail, you fire them. Well, then you don't get the kind of innovation that you do want. And this doesn't matter whether it's a Toyota or a Facebook or indeed a hospital or the Metropolitan Police of London, right? You want beat officers who are patrolling the streets of London and making instinctive judgment calls on whether I should stop and search someone on the street. Right? Because this can either save someone's life or it can be a tremendously disruptive event in someone's life that completely changes their vision of policing, of the state, of their relationship with the community in which they live. And you need to train those police officers to have good judgment in that context. And sometimes they're going to make mistakes. And if they do, how are you going to create a culture where you don't punish them for that? And you help them learn from that. Just like in the Toyota case, it says, why did we save more time than you said we were going to save? That's the bit that organizations often miss, and few organizations do get it right, but it's very, very, very hard to do, right? It takes a lot of management because you have to resist that urge to sort of go in there and try fix it yourself.
Is there a good illustration of an organization that does get it right that we can look to?
So one organization I do profile in the book, which is in the not-for-profit sector, is the University Hospital System at Oxford. It is sort of a very large hospital system, one of the largest in the world, and premier sort of medical research center like University of Chicago hospitals. And for the first time in its history, 2 years or a year and a half before COVID, it appoints as its chief medical officer someone who is not an Oxford graduate, not in that particular case was a woman, was a person of color, had been born outside the United Kingdom. So there were lots of firsts there, but probably the first that really mattered was they didn't have an Oxford degree. And say, why would a organization like University of Oxford Hospitals appoint an outsider like that to run this system? When you've got all these Nobel Prize winning physicians there and people who have been coming up through the ranks. Well, part of the reason is that the hospital chain or the hospital system in the year before this individual was appointed had 7 never events. So a never event is like where you operate on the wrong limb, right? It should never happen. That's why it's a never event. And 7 is a lot. You don't want 7. So there was clearly something off with the culture. And so she comes in as the CMO, the chief medical officer, and she says, well, part of the problem is that you've got sort of, these entrepreneurial surgeons who are off doing, prize-winning work. And they don't perhaps look at the checklists, right, that they need to look at before a surgery, because, of course, why would a Nobel Prize winner want to look at a checklist before they go do surgery? And so that's the spirit or sense in which she says, okay, we need to build more of a team spirit. We need to build more of a culture where we're actively listening in the context of people like the nurse in that operating theater will have that information. And we need a culture where there is an active listening between the surgeon and the nurse. So she starts creating this culture and she starts investing in building it. And she's 13 months into it before COVID hits. And the never events are down from 7 to 2, so it's not quite 0, but there's been progress. Staff morale, particularly from non-doctors in the hospital system, has started to slowly improve, but the crisis hits. And when the crisis hits, one of the things that the Prime Minister of the UK at the time was Boris Johnson does is get on radio and announce on radio that all elective surgeries will continue. And part of the reason, I mean, it's not crazy to do that. Part of the reason was that they would otherwise have this tremendous backlog and they wanted to make sure that, but of course, remember in March 2020, we didn't have PPE, we didn't have personal protective equipment, we didn't know how infectious this virus was going to be, we didn't have a sense of how deadly it was going to be. There was all of this anxiety, right? No testing, no protective equipment. So the surgeons were not so sure that, or some surgeons at least, were not so sure that that was what they wanted to do. And they threatened to basically go on strike, right? And they said, look, there's no way we're going to follow this directive. Now, she had in the, so the University of Oxford Hospital is part of what's called the National Health System in the UK. And she had what the NHS somewhat unfortunately calls Gold Commander Authority, which means that it's almost like military command authority because it's a time of crisis, like COVID was a crisis moment. And so many of her colleagues around her say, you just need to order them to do this because you have the authority to, and this is the government's mandate. And she says, but that's inconsistent with the culture we're trying to build. And then, of course, one staffer says to her, yeah, now's not the time for building that culture. Now's the time for managing this crisis. And she says, hell no. If you don't live the culture in this crisis, then what are we building it for, right? So she takes a gamble. This is the point about you have to take risks, right? And you have the good judgment to take the good risks. And she turns over the decision to the surgeons. She says, let's get you guys to be in charge of this decision. And because of the role that Oxford plays within the UK, what happens in the Oxford hospital system quickly becomes NHS-wide policy. So you will be sort of, in some sense, the leading indicator on what is the right policy here. And then through the culture of active listening that she's created, the surgeons eventually come to a decision that they can continue some elective surgeries, but it's their decision rather than the Prime Minister announcing it on the radio, right? So that's the sense in which she's invested in building that. And that's another example, a la Toyota, of a company that, or an organization in this case, that can do it. But it takes a lot of work, right? It's so easy to be the gold commander. And everyone around you is saying, be the gold commander. So it takes a different kind of leader to have that judgment call.
Well, now all of you get a chance to be the gold commander because we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just put up your hand. We have a microphone here in the back, but we'll want to make sure that we get you the microphone before you ask that question. So we at least have one over here, right there.
Thank you. So when talking about judgment, and as we said, it's nice to be data-driven, but often data is incomplete or maybe inaccurate. But judgment has a problem of cognitive bias, right? I've seen this situation similar to this before. I'm going to react and base it totally on what has worked in the past, when maybe the solution, and this could have happened in the pandemic, needs to be something that I haven't experienced. So judgment, sometimes we call it informed gut.
Yeah.
We've done something 10,000 times, whatever, but it's still, we suffer from cognitive bias.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And two things come to mind when you say that. One is, Cresta Dick, who is the commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police at the time when I profile that organization in the book, she's since moved on from the role, where she was fired from the role. She talked about, because she was managing the police force during this very, very difficult time of COVID, the murder of George Floyd, abysmal data around stop and search in London and how it was racially discriminatory. And, I mean, as a leader of an organization like a police force at the time, she was under enormous strain. And the commissioner of the London police actually has two bosses, which makes always things much harder. One was the mayor of London, who is Sadiq Khan, still the mayor of London, sort of quite left-wing Labour Party person. And the other was the Home Secretary at the time, Priti Patel, was a very right-wing person. And so they were actively criticizing each other and the commissioner of the police in the media while this was all happening. And so we talk about how she's able to make decisions in that moment. And she says, building to what we said earlier, a community of trusted people who had different lived experiences from her own, she had joined the police force at 21, and she had been in the police force for 40 years. So that was her lived experience, all the cognitive biases that come from that. She'd been part of previous investigations into racial discrimination of the London police well before she was commissioner. So of course, she was carrying the burden of that. And she quickly realized her cognition was not going to be the one that was right. So she brings in these people that, come from other walks of life, and they become her little sort of sounding boards on this. Importantly, she trusts them and they trust her enough to be honest with her, right? And that's really, really important. And I think you made a really important point also about the nature of education for judgment. This isn't a story I put in the book, but it's a story that was told to me by my colleague, Dutch Leonard, who teaches management at Harvard Kennedy School. And he talks about how, when the SEAL Team 6 was preparing for the raid on the compound in Abbottabad, where Osama bin Laden was suspected to be, the CIA had, of course, mapped the compound from above. And so you knew what was the structure of the compound, et cetera. Everything of that was well known. But what was not known was what the internal structure of that building looked like, because obviously you didn't know what it looked like inside. So somewhere in, I think it was suburban Virginia or something like that, they built an exact scale replica of that compound. And, the idea was, okay, we'll make an informed guess of what it might look like because we know what an average Pakistani house looks like, et cetera. And then, of course, the people who were in charge of the training said, of course not. You want to make the internal walls movable. So every time the SEAL team went in as a rehearsal, they had a completely different floor plan, right? When they went inside. And the idea was, of course, you will never encounter the floor plan that you will see on the ground, but we're preparing you to deal with whatever floor plan you do encounter. So they did countless tests, but it was with these different floor plans, right? So that's part of this education for judgment that we're talking about.
Wonderful. Other questions? Yes, we'll get one right there. Yes.
This is a question on tactics, and it's what should you do if, in addition to outrage, those who tend to put out fires in an organization get the most visibility, often to your colleague who's running around doing everything that will be rewarded as opposed to the smooth sailing ship, which looks rather boring. What do you do, not just as a manager, in catching yourself from maybe rewarding not so good behavior? But if you're that person who's in the position when you're fresh out of business school and you recognize this, what tactics, what can you do to maybe turn the tables or at least mitigate that?
So if I understand, the situation is where somebody is doing sort of the big showy thing and getting a lot of the attention, while the person who's doing the quiet, important thing is not. Is that the...
Or is not allowing fires of outrage and others to build
Right.
in order to put them out,
Right.
to show how good they are and strong they are. It's
Yeah.
just, they're actually such a good manager.
Yeah.
Maybe that outrage never even hits
Yeah.
the floor.
Yeah. So I don't know whether you guys cover the Eisenhower matrix as part of the leadership training here, but this is this 2x2 of the urgent and the important, right? And the idea that if you focus on the urgent, then what ends up happening is more and more things become urgent, right? And is it an endless supply of urgent problems? So go back to that CMO of Oxford University Hospitals. She said something to that end, right? She said, look, the nature, this was 3 weeks into the pandemic, the nature of the decisions that were coming to her, she was getting something like 200 emails every 30 minutes, right? She says something very wrong if I'm getting 200 emails every 30 minutes, because there's no human being who's going to be able to process 200 emails every 30 minutes. So we need to actually double down on this culture where we're delegating this information and we're empowering people to. And my role as the CMO is not to focus on the urgent firefighting, but rather to focus on what is the important, which is how do we create the conditions where people in this organization are empowered to make those decisions at the level at which they're first encountered. And in that particular context, it required the leader in there to, in fact, resist the urge. She was getting the advice to say, you should be the hero in this situation. She was resisting the urge to do that. And she was, in some sense, turning that and pushing that back down on the organization by trying to create this culture. There were further situations or further contexts where because the nature of the crisis, the kind of problems that came to you one day there was a problem of, well, you've got a 22-year-old motorcycle victim who needs a ventilator, and you've got an 80-something-year-old COVID patient who needs a ventilator, and there's only one ventilator left, and who makes that call? Is it the triage a nurse? Is it the ER attending? And that sort of thing. And it was about then creating mental health support for the people on the front line so that when they were making those decisions, they also had a support system to equip them. Because, I mean, if they came back the next day without the ability to make the fresh set of decisions. So that's what the CMO in that situation focused on, and rather than making the decisions herself. And I think part of it is being in an organization and working to affect an organization so that that's how the decisions are made. Sometimes you find yourself, there's this great case of James Burke when he was this is before he becomes CEO of Johnson & Johnson. This is when he's rising through the ranks at Johnson & Johnson. And he talks about, this moment where he feels like he's in the wrong company. He joins Johnson & Johnson, spends a lot of time there, thoroughly enjoys it. And then he feels like he's in the wrong company. He feels like, this is not the company that is for him. And I mean, of course, fast forward, we don't know this at the time, but fast forward, and he goes on to become this iconic CEO of Johnson & Johnson that is sort of, memorialized in management lore. But he's having this crisis of confidence. And he says, when you're having that crisis of confidence, you are probably in one of three things. You're wrong for the organization has shifted around you, or maybe you have the wrong boss, right? So he actually briefly leaves Johnson & Johnson for, I think, a few months. And then the boss that had made the life for him there sort of unworkable is himself removed from the role. And Burke is quickly hired back. So now, of course, life doesn't always play out so wonderfully. But that's another story that comes to mind about sometimes you have the wrong boss, even if you're in the right organization.
Take other questions right down here in front.
Thank you for your time. One of my questions is, we use the words management and leadership kind of interchangeably throughout the talk. And for me personally, I see a little bit of a delineation between where management is and where leadership is. To your Google point, management is, hey, we don't talk about that at work. Leadership is, this is a conversation that maybe we could have. In the course of, your book, the classes that you speak, is there a way for firms, governments, nonprofits to take a proactive approach to who they are selecting for those, leadership roles that are looked up to as visionary, or that are going to set kind of the example, that would say? And how does that differentiate from how we select our managers, or what kind of consideration should be given to those roles? This kind of seems like we're taking a reflective look and looking back at past examples, and maybe there's examples that you don't hear about them. You don't have to see the outrage or the crisis, because they do a good job of it, as we discussed. Thank you.
Exactly right. Yeah, fantastic question. So two things, right? I mean, and partly I think, we are to blame in the sense of, I taught leadership at a business school. I teach it now at a school of government. And the kinds of stories we tell of leadership are these sort of, stories of leaders riding in on, white horses and shining armor, and sort of somehow solving all the problems that the organization has. And then, you talk to this sort of a Platonic vision of creating a noble myth around which you rallied the organization. And then you talk about sort of using the power of rhetoric to get things done and so forth. And part of where I sort of, as I go through this process myself over the years I taught this course and then eventually wrote the book, realized that, so the classical Greeks talked about 4 virtues of leadership: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. It's the temperance bit that we don't spend a lot of time on in leadership classes. And how can we bring more temperate leaders into play? And temperance sometimes in sort of modern management or leadership literature gets a little bit of a bad rep, because it's seen as sort of compromise or consensus and things like that. And that's seen as weak leadership. But some of the classic examples of temperate leaders in recent times would be people like Nelson Mandela or Itzhak Rabin, who they were very clear about what it is they wanted to accomplish, but recognized that they couldn't just force it down, right? And so Mandela, when he takes over as president after the sort of the end of apartheid, he has enormous sort of positional power at that time. He could affect anything he wanted. But rather, what he most wanted was to affect a society where no one with that kind of positional power would abuse it. So he starts sort of inverting that relationship and saying, how do the right answers come from the sort of the processes that we create, rather than sort of direct them? So perhaps we don't spend enough time on those temperate models of leadership, which might be especially useful in this age of outrage. I mean, one of the things I say in the preface is, look, for instance, whatever happens in November, that is to say in 3 or 4 days, we're still going to be a very, very divided country, right? And, of course, you can say, well, I'm just going to have it my way or the highway. But then this book is not for you, right? I mean, you might as well stop reading at that point. But if you said, no, I don't want to do it that way, I don't want to resort to violence in the worst case, then how might I build an organization or institution where we can still thrive and still have human fulfillment, but recognize that we'll have to sort of come up with decisions from the bottom up rather from the top down? And that's not weakness necessarily. That's kind of what our chief medical officer does in that case study, and many other people sort of that we can profile. But yeah, let's stop there because there are
Let's see
other
if we can
hands.
get at least one more question here in the back.
Hello, I'm a PhD student in communications, and my question's about social media. I was wondering what the leaders you spoke to, do they see it as a necessary evil or something to outsource to their PR team, or did you actually find instances of leaders communicating with some sort of nuance on social media?
Yeah. So look, social media is clearly a catalytic factor as we think about the age of outrage and those 3 causal factors that I talked about: a fear of the future, this sense of a raw deal, and this ideologies of othering. sometimes people ask, where's social media in that? Isn't social media? And I say, well, yes, of course it's important, but it's catalytic rather than causal. In that, I mean, it's really the velocity of the feedback in some sense that we've not really evolved to deal with feedback. I mean, I turn my phone off when I'm in talks like this on Do Not Disturb, because otherwise it's like there's 8 different apps that are constantly feeding me from, so-and-so said this and so did that. And we've not evolved to deal with that kind of thing, right? And so that's the sense in which it can be quite disruptive. So we've run from time to time a program for very senior leaders from a particular country who, so basically when they're new members of the legislature in that country, as long as they're new in the sense that they're freshman legislators, they're brought to this program at the school to be taught things like, the data things, like basically how to read a balance sheet. And so we don't teach sort of political things there. We just sort of, it's like public administration hygiene almost. And but the one rule we have is that there's a basket outside the classroom where people leave their phones, right? And part of that is you want to create an environment where you're not constantly assaulted with feedback and or sort of provoked to use that as a mechanism to do that. And I think it, especially for people who are under the age of 16, there seemed to be growing evidence that the addictive nature of social media is very, very harmful. And there might well be a time when, having under 16-year-olds play on social media would be seen in the future as crazy as having under 16-year-olds smoke cigarettes, because the brain is so plastic at that age, and we're just not sort of built to deal with that kind of addiction. There's a lot to be said and a lot of science happening in that space of what is social media doing to our brains. But the managerial implication of that, again, going back to the previous comment, is that of temperance, right? So it can be a very powerful and effective tool. And in the book, we see leaders who use it very cleverly to get what they need done, but also very sparingly, right? And they have the discipline to stay away from it when the time is right. And especially when it comes to coalition building. There's a story in the book of a really remarkable person called Priscilla Ankut. Priscilla was appointed as the first CEO of something called the Kaduna State Peace Commission. Kaduna State is a state in north-central Nigeria. And like much of Nigeria is divided on sort of north-south lines. There's a Muslim north and a Christian south to the state. It's a state that's unfortunately had to deal with a lot of violence. And Priscilla is appointed by its governor, who is from the Muslim north and is seen as sort of almost this Trumpian-like figure who is very sort of, direct and sometimes very divisive. He quite sort of surprisingly creates this peace commission and appoints Priscilla as its CEO. And Priscilla is from the Christian South. She is an AU and African Union technocrat. And she comes into this role and like a good data-driven manager, she's got that AU, EU type background. She sort of starts looking and says, okay, I'm in the peace commission. I need to sort of try address the violence here. What's going on in the violence? And she starts looking at the violence and she realizes that it's cyclical, that you can predict the violence. And the key predictor in the violence is elections. So as you come up closer to elections, then there's this industry of violence. And of course, there are people on social media that are basically, stoking that violence. They are in that industry. And so she said, I mean, sometimes it's malicious, sometimes it's not malicious. Sometimes they're speaking very passionately. So again, she does some careful work and identifies who are the catalytic social media protagonists in her context. And she brings them all together in something she calls the House of Kaduna family. Now, when you first hear this, it's like, wow, that sounds corny as hell. What the hell is it? But it's a really powerful thing she's done. She has brought these people together in an ad personam capacity, not in some sort of ex officio capacity. They might represent various religious groups or political groups or such. She says, no, I just want you here as human beings. And she, in this House of Kaduna family, creates an environment where they get to know each other, their antagonists, in a personal setting, right? And they do little exercises and teamwork together and things like that, right? And so then, and Michelle Obama, I think, has this line where you can't hate someone when you know them, right? And that's kind of what she's trying to implicitly get at. So then when the election comes around, these people are sort of inherently prone to self-moderate, right? I mean, the violence doesn't go away by no means. There's still a lot of violence there. But you start making a difference because you've humanized people through this institution. And part of what was essential was using social media to identify who are the people to bring around the table, right? And then creating the conditions where they got to know each other outside of social media. Because often they'd never spoken to the people that they were hating on the internet, right? And so that's another institution that was absolutely fascinating. It was the head of the Ford Foundation in West Africa who first introduced me to Priscilla because they'd been funding and supporting some of this work. And it's just what courage to do something like that. But as is the case with all of these leaders, or most of the leaders profiled in the book, after a certain set of time, that they've in that role, they step away from it. And part of the reason they step away from it is because it takes an enormous toll on them personally. You have to be on all the time, right? And even if you're building this organization that is making the decisions, et cetera, you are trying to sustain this culture in the context of a world that is otherwise on fire, right? So you're trying to sort of create this culture of excellence and empathy in a world that is outraged. And so they get to this moment where personal resilience is really important. But the good news is that most of these leaders have built an organization where there are a lot of people who can take over, right? And that's part of good leadership, is that you're sort of constantly working on succession training and succession planning. And so, for some it's 4 years, for some it's 8 years, but they sort of cycle out and then take some time and then go do something else, et cetera. So resilience is a theme we didn't touch on so far. So I wanted to close with that.
Well, unfortunately, we're not going to have a chance to get to all the questions, although I suspect Karthik would be glad to answer them as you purchase your own copy of The Age of Outrage, which you can do just off to my right, where he'll be signing books right after the talk concludes. But I have one last question, and that is, the antidote to the Age of Outrage is not complacency. And I want to come back to kind of these Masters of Public Policy students, and you were struck by the fact that they seemed different in some way from your students at Harvard Business School. So I'm curious, thinking about the business school students in this room and MBAs generally, is there anything that they can learn about from the relative lack of complacency of their peers at a place like the Harris School of Public Policy or at your home institution that might also be a different kind of corrective from the one that we've been describing, especially in an age when people do feel outraged by many things?
That's a very interesting question. So, the students that I've taught at two places only in my career. One is the Harvard MBA program, and the other is the Oxford MPP program. I mean, obviously, incredibly bright students in both contexts. There is more of a clarity of purpose in a business school, and it's that clarity of purpose that allows for, I suppose, cleaner development of strategy. And with the cleaner development of strategy, you then have sort of an ability to then say, okay, what's our path to implementation? In government, you often don't have, outside of the military, clear lines of authority. In public organizations, you don't have clear lines of accountability. There's no sort of sense that we serve shareholders. There's sort of multiple stakeholders, and it's not clear. And of course, resources are always really, really, scarce. One organization that embodies excellence, at least at the time I profiled it, I think still today, that operates in the public sector, that may have a lot to teach business, is the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Very, very specific. So now you think about this, for the U.S. Attorney's Office, like in any district, you've got these, I think it's 90 something federal districts. And so the Southern District of New York is basically Manhattan. And so it's effectively like the jurisdiction that polices Wall Street, and of course all the other sort of things that U.S. Attorney offices have to deal with. But you think about their recruiting. They're able to recruit some of the top Supreme Court clerks that come out of sort of the American legal school machinery. And they're able to recruit them at New York City public salaries, right? Which are, I mean, by international standards, not ungenerous, but by New York City standards, certainly by the opportunity cost of these people, it's maybe they get 60, 70,000 a year, when if you were getting a Supreme Court clerkship, your signing bonus is 250,000. That's just your signing bonus. So they're foregoing that, and they're going to work for the Southern District of New York. It's like, wow, how do they do this? And they've got a really interesting recruitment strategy. Number one, they only hire the best of the best. And that creates some concern that they're perhaps quite elitist for an organization that's in public service. So there might be pros and cons to that. Second, they have almost a cult-like culture. And just like with Google, you say Googlers. The SDNY alumni are really, really, that's the proudest thing. I mean, these guys have gotten summa cum laude JDs at Yale. They'll have got summa cum laude ABs at Chicago or Harvard, and they might be Rhodes Scholars, et cetera, but they will say SDNY alum. They are so proud of being an SDNY alum. And the sort of the caption or the mantra of the SDNY is do the right thing, which again sounds a little hokey, right? Do the right thing, do the right thing. But they sort of drill that into people. Then what happens is they hire these really young, bright people, and to the point earlier, they train them with this culture, and there's radical decentralization, right? So you could be a 25, 26-year-old attorney, and you are sitting on the opposite side in the courtroom of some of the top defense attorneys in the country, people with 30, 40 years experience. So it's like an incredible opportunity, that you would not get if you were like some first-year associate, claiming your 250K signing bonus. So these people are attracted by the fact that they have this. Now, the interesting thing the SDNY does, or at least did at the time we profiled it, was after 5 or 6 years there, these young hotshots are asked to leave. They're asked to go out into it, right? And that sort of fuels its own concerns about the revolving door and so forth. But it creates a very strong alumni network of SDNY alums in private practice. And then the senior management of the SDNY, these would be the US attorneys and the people who are heads of the criminal division, civil division, et cetera, are usually the young folks who have gone, spent 20 years in various other roles, and then they're brought back because they get the culture. They get how important it is. And then they sort of drive the leadership in that next generation. And I heard when we were doing the interviews for the case, I heard the story, perhaps apocryphal. I was never able to verify it, that when a new US attorney is appointed, regardless of party identity, even the US attorney appointed in the last Trump administration, all other living former US attorneys gather with this appointee for a dinner party, and they make the appointee sign their resignation letter. And they say, we'll have this on file, right? Because you have to protect what is the culture of this organization. Now, again, there's a sort of cult-like emphasis to it, but it's an interesting way with very low resources. They've been able to create this organization of excellence. And within the other US attorney offices, SDNY, which is Southern District of New York, is often referred to as Sovereign District of New York, because actually the court there is older than the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court sat after the court in the Southern District of New York sat. And so they see themselves as the mother court of America. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's there. So that's all part of the lore of how a public organization creates excellence with, quite frankly, very few resources. And there might be something to learn from that, even in the sharpest, harshest private settings, private equity or whatever you want to talk about. Yeah.
Well, I can't think of a better lesson for us to conclude on: the age of outrage, how to lead in a polarized world. Karthik Ramanna, thank you so much for joining.